On today's show, Karl Anthony-Towns traded to the New York Knicks. How does Cat fit in New York? And does this move put the Knicks on the same tier as the Boston Celtics? It's all coming up on today's Locked On NBA.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the biggest stories with the local experts. I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, also host of Locked On Rockets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Look, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the exact same page where you actually place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. So head on over to FanDuel.com. You can take a look at so many different things like the different season awards, who's going to win which conference, or just the outright Super Bowl favorites. Right now, the Kansas City Chiefs at plus 500 to win it all. Behind them, the 49ers at plus 650, the Ravens at plus 800, the Buffalo Bills at plus 1,000, and then the Houston Texans right there at plus 1,300. So for all those odds and so much more, be sure to visit FanDuel.com. Joining us now is the host of Locked On Wolves, Ben Beecken, who you can track down wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Wolves. And Ben, man, the Minnesota Timberwolves, fresh off of a Western Conference Finals run, have just traded their franchise guy, former #1 overall pick, Karl Anthony-Towns. Like, this trade comes out of nowhere. It really did. This was like, they hit us with a blockbuster over the weekend. They get a return of Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo, and a future first-round pick. Help me make sense of this. Why make this trade if you're the Wolves?
Yeah, I mean, it was really out of nowhere. I think at this point, especially in the offseason, like, I don't know that we've had a trade this big. I mean, like, I think of like James Harden from OKC to Houston like 10 years ago is like kind of, I think that was maybe even a little later in training camp. But yeah, I think at this point, like, everyone kind of figured the Wolves would make a move like this eventually because of the cap hell that they're about to be in, and kind of already are. Luxury tax really is luxury tax hell is a better way to say it. I thought it would be next summer, or maybe at the deadline if things weren't going as according to plan, because you're already like, they had until the end of the season to get under the second apron, or to get under really to pay less tax, essentially get under the second apron really. So the timing on this is really more just like, hey, let's get it done before the season. Let's pay less tax over the course of the season as much as possible. And I'm sure that there was motivation on the Knicks side to get it done. And the reporting has been that Dante DiVincenzo had been off the table until recently, and him plus the protected Detroit pick is what really tipped the scales to get it to happen. Now the Knicks have been after Cat for a long time. There's been reporting to that effect for a long time. The only reason the Wolves are doing this, I'm a firm believer that from a pure basketball standpoint, it actually makes the Wolves roster worse. Maybe not significantly. It's hard to say at this point, but Cat's the best player in the deal, and it's a tough sell when you go to the conference finals and then, you turn around and trade your second best player and somebody who's been at the franchise for 9 years, and the team doesn't get obviously better. And we can argue about that if they got slightly worse, slightly better. I would argue they got slightly worse. But the idea is that now in the future, there's a little bit more flexibility. Julius Randle has a player option for next year. He probably walks. You get DiVincenzo on a friendly contract. So it's financials is the reason to do it. And the hope is that, it's a neutral move in terms of on the court. And if Ant continues to ascend, then, ultimately maybe it doesn't hurt you in the long term. It's just a really hard thing to swallow, I think, for Wolves fans right now, coming off such a successful season.
Yeah, I think it's also really unfortunate, just as a quick aside before we get back into more of the nitty-gritty about the actual trade itself, the ramifications for it. This has got to suck for Cat, right? Like, Cat's a guy who gave this organization so much, did so much for the community, and stuck through the Wolves through thick and thin, and there were a lot of lean years there in Minnesota, and he never really wavered, right? Despite being constantly thrown in trade discussions and speculation, he was like, no, I'm bought in on being a Minnesota Timberwolves, and that doesn't happen a lot. Like, I feel like, sometimes players maybe are just like, get me out of here, I'm ready to leave, especially once a team starts performing poorly, all that stuff. And Cat, I don't know, I just feel like Cat got a really rough shake of things here.
No, 100%. And I mean, Cat's been nothing but great in Minnesota. He's said all the right things and he's meant it. He's a really genuine person, and everybody's loved him. Everyone that's covered him has loved him. I mean, think about the accolades. Winning Rookie of the Year. He's been NBA all NBA third team twice. He's won 4 All-Star. Or been to 4 All-Star games. He's won the 3-point shooting contest. Like all these different things he's done. And the Wolves, like there was the Jimmy Butler year where he was the clear cut second best player. And then there now is the Ant era. Those are the only times he's made the playoffs in a Timberwolves uniform. And he's completely changed just this last year, completely changed, sacrificed the way he played because he knew he was the number 2 option on offense, not number 1 anymore. And he needed to have a different role defensively. And it's one that suited him better than what he'd done previously. He's not a rim protecting big, right? And like the playoffs are the best example. And I said this on, I did a show on Saturday for Locked On Wolves about the trade. And I think that probably the way he defended in the playoffs, he defended Kevin Durant as the primary in the first round in that sweep over the Suns. He was the best defender against Nikola Jokic in their second round win in 7 games over Denver. I guarantee you that Tibbs looked at that and was like, all right, we could do a little bit with him defensively. He's maybe a little more versatile and he gets it more now than he did when I coached him in Minnesota. And of course, with some injuries, Mitchell Robinson and guys being hurt, he may end up needing to be a little bit more of a 5 than a 4 in New York. But yeah, I mean, it's too bad for him. And it just from a timing perspective, everything he poured into being in Minnesota and right after going to the conference finals too, to have this kind of, and right before the season too, right? Like all the timing, the time of year, is a really tough thing. And Wolves fans, loyal Wolves fans who have followed Cat through thick and thin over 9 years, I think it's like I said, a tough pill to swallow for them too.
Well, as long as you're Tibbs and you've got OG Anunoby, who you can slot in at the 5 to clamp Joel Embiid, then you can play Cat at the 4 all the live long day. Look, when you look at the return for Minnesota here, the actual player return, Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo, it seems like, first off, Dante DiVincenzo was kind of the key to this trade, right? Like things didn't open up until DiVincenzo was on the table. And obviously, look, don't get me wrong, DiVincenzo is a great player. He's on a fantastic contract. I don't understand why that was such like a like is he really the crown jewel of you trade your franchise guy for Dante DiVincenzo? And the other part of it is DiVincenzo reportedly wasn't really looking forward to like a reduced role in New York coming off the bench after the season that he just had, and all the stuff with the Nova Knicks that we were kind of speculating about. But is he not also going to have a similar role in Minnesota? Like he's not going to be in the starting lineup, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think on the plus side with DiVincenzo, it makes a lot of sense. He's really kind of the perfect role player. I think he fits any team perfectly. Mm-hmm. He's a really good off-ball defender. Digging into some of the B-ball index numbers and stuff like that, his off-ball defense is really good. He's not going to have to be a primary on-ball defender in Minnesota. Like, obviously they had Anunoby in New York. They had some good defenders, but the Wolves also have some really good defenders on the perimeter in Jaden McDaniels and Anthony Edwards and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. So he can be more of like that secondary ball handler defensive guy on the perimeter for them. And he was like basically 41% catch and shoot threes last year, and immediately upgrades some of their shooting off the bench. I think he's got a better track record of shooting the 3 than Nickeil Alexander-Walker. I do think you're right about his role. I don't see how his role is necessarily all that much bigger in Minnesota than it would have been in New York, but it could eat into Nickeil Alexander-Walker's minutes a little bit. Alexander-Walker is a really good player and a great perimeter defender, and he's bigger and longer than DiVincenzo, but he's a streakier 3-point shooter. He's less proven on the offensive end of the floor. So I think those two guys, that's going to be kind of the tussle for minutes. But you're right. I don't think he starts unless they decide to, if Mike Conley, they don't have very many point guards on the roster either. They have Mike Conley and they have rookie Rob Dillingham. So God forbid something happens to Conley or Dillingham for a period of time. There's always a chance that they say, all right, we're going to basically play Ant at point guard and start DiVincenzo with him and just play, bigger. And, maybe he starts as kind of like a combo guard, secondary initiator type of a role. But you're right. I think his role in Minnesota is similar to what it would have been with the Knicks. But the cost control and the bargain of his contract is, I think, the biggest thing. I think he averages around 11 million in each of the next 3 years. And where the Wolves are cap wise, that's super important when he could start, he could be your, first guard off the bench. He's a very versatile role player that could do a lot of different things. And I clearly one of the better salary bargains in the league. And that was obviously a big reason why the Wolves really wanted him included.
The kind of square peg round hole of this whole situation, though, is Julius Randle, who at this point is maybe being a little bit underrated, maybe in some of the post trade discussions around, you know, the reaction to this deal. People forget, right? Randle's an all-star, he's an all NBA caliber talent, but at the same time, the fit is a little wonky with a front court of Rudy Gobert and Julius Randle. You go from the incredible spacing that Karl Anthony-Towns provide to Julius Randle, who he shoots a volume of threes. He doesn't exactly shoot them at a high percentage, unfortunately, coming off a season where he shot just 31%, the season before that 34%. Now, his career high, he was 41% his first year as an all-star. So, like, he has had maybe some volatility in the three-point shoot numbers, but how, that's, I think, the biggest concern here is how does that fit even begin to work?
Yeah, I mean, that was my immediate reaction was that really hurts. Part of the reason one of the main reasons essentially the two center quote unquote lineup worked for Minnesota is because Cat's one of the best three-point shooters, not just big men three-point shooters, but best shooters in the league, full stop. So it works because one of them doesn't play like a center most of the time. But now Julius Randle, obviously not really a center at this point, but he's a high volume big who doesn't shoot threes accurately. So that will clog up the space in a little bit. I think the hope is like he does draw fouls and get to the free throw line better than Karl Anthony-Towns. So that to me is the one kind of I guess positive. That's maybe the one thing he does. He's maybe a little bit of a better passer than Cat. That's really the one thing he can do better than Cat. What concerns me is when Ant's ready to drive into the paint, or if Julius Randle says like, hey, I'm going to use this possession. I'm going to take one of my, kind of patented difficult mid-range shots that he's good at shooting. But then what's Ant going to do, right? And like, what's the spacing look like if Rudy's in the dunker spot and Julius Randle's driving, kicks it to Ant, then Ant wants to drive. And the Wolves even had challenges with it last year. Like I've seen people saying like, well, the Wolves didn't have good spacing last year anyway. And it's like, that might be true, but it's not going to get better by putting Randle in Cat's spot. There was certainly some growth to be had for the Wolves offense. It was middle of the pack the entire season. It wasn't ever a top 10 offense. But losing Karl Anthony-Towns is not going to make the offense better. So there's certainly going to be some clunkiness. Chris Finch was I think he was the associate head coach with the Pelicans the one season that Randle spent there, and he had really kind of his breakout. I think it was the first year he scored 20 plus per game in New Orleans with Chris Finch kind of coordinating that offense. So clearly Finch signed off on this and knows Randle well enough after coaching him for a season. And I think it certainly can work. It's just not going to be quite as like synergistic as a 41%. 42% three-point shooter in the four spot. So there's going to be some massaging that needs to be had in terms of the Wolves offense, but hopefully DiVincenzo adds some shooting that you lose in Karl Anthony-Towns, and they can kind of figure out like, hey, how does this whole thing work with Randle and Ant both getting the ball in their hands enough to do damage offensively?
How will the Wolves look this season after the Karl Anthony-Towns trade? How will Julius Randle and Dante DiVincenzo factor in to the rotation and lineups this season alongside guys like Anthony Edwards? You're going to have us covered for all of that and so much more over at Locked On Wolves. Ben, thanks for stopping by Locked On NBA with me.
Of course. Thanks for having me.